So now we're taking a look at pattern 7. This is probably the pattern you're going to write more often than any other. We write pattern 7s more than any of the other 10 patterns by far. So we'll be familiar with this one. Pattern 7, once again, we're still working with our action verbs. So now what we're going to do is we're going to build off of 6, but now we're going to go from an intransitive verb to what we would call transitive verbs. So looking at the pattern, we start off with noun phrase 1. We've come across that before. We have a noun phrase 1. We had that back in pattern 3 and pattern 5, that little subscript. So NP1 means noun phrase 1. It's still our subject. Now we have our verb, which is transitive. Once again, don't be thrown off by this extra little dash here. It's all one big thing. It's just to be VTR, meaning verb transitive. This is a transitive verb. It's a verb that then transfers, for lack of a better word, over to another noun. And so it's a verb that almost forces us to answer the question of what, or answer the question of whom. It's making us move beyond that. We couldn't simply put a period there. There's actually, it's anticipating something that follows it. And what it's anticipating is noun phrase 2, which is our direct object. I want you to see that noun phrase 2 has that subscript of 2. Well, the reason that it has that subscript of 2 is it is different from noun phrase 1. So now what we have is we have a subject and we have this noun, the other half, which is our direct object, but it is different. All right? It's not like a pattern 3 or a pattern 5 where I'm renaming the subject and I'm completing the subject. This direct object is different, and therefore we have this different subscript. So when we build these, we have a place for our subject. We have a place for our verb. Remember, so it's always the subject and the verb. And now I'm going to draw a line. And I'm going to put in that third noun. So this looks like a pattern 3. It looks for like a pattern 5. But you're going to notice a difference, particularly in the way that this guy right here is perpendicular. So first off, this is what we're going to call our direct object. A direct object always follows an action verb, and it answers 2 questions of either what or whom. What or whom. The other thing we want to notice then is there's this perpendicular line. And so that's our way of letting me know that you're dealing with an action verb. If I slanted that line, then that would let me know you're dealing with either a to be verb or a linking verb. But a straight line or a perpendicular line is letting me know that you're dealing with an action verb. And the reason it's straight like that is basically I don't want it pointing backwards to that subject because that noun is not. That's why it has a different subscript. That is a completely different noun than the subject. They're referring to 2 different things. Let me show you what I mean. Alonzo wore a bag on his head. All right, so Alonzo is my subject noun, but here's bag as my direct object. We're saying Alonzo wore what? A bag. Here's my direct object. And so Alonzo is not a bag, so that's why I'm going to keep them separate. But those are our 3 most important words. Alonzo wore bag. Those are the 3 things I need. So let's build that first. Yeah, it is funny. Bag head. All right, here we go. So let's get Alonzo in here. Here's wore, and then here's bag. All right, so those are the 3 most important words. Alonzo wore bag. We fill in everything else as a bag, and it's a bag on his head. Even though on his head sitting way out here, it's not really a bag on his head as much as it is he wore it on his head. It tells us where he wore it. So I like putting that one particularly underneath the word wore. He wore it on his head. So we have on head, and then his head, and then a bag. This is a pattern 7. Once again, you'll notice there's this perpendicular line. That's what's critical about this one. Another one. We looked up the answers online. So here's our subject, we. And then looked up is our whole verb. That's tricky because if you only treated the word looked, like we looked, then up would have to be a prep phrase. We looked, it's like saying we looked where? Up the answers. You didn't look where up the answers, but you looked up, or it's like an idiom. We're saying we researched the answers. So looked up is one big verb. All right, so we looked up. Once again, remember we talked about phrasal verbs. This is an idiom. So what we've done is we've actually created a particle with that verb and created a phrasal verb. And then we have our direct object. We looked up or we researched what? Answers is our direct object. All right, and then we have the answers. Online is an interesting thing because it's a location. It's a virtual location, but it is a location. It answers the question of where. So that's an adverb. So even, once again, just because it's next to the word answers doesn't mean that it describes answers. It's telling us where you look them up. So sometimes those adverbs can have that sense of mobility about them. So in this case, I'm going to put online underneath looked up. Last example for us for pattern 7. A bunch of knuckleheads released a dozen piglets in the visitor's locker room. So when I look at the subject, I can see a bunch of knuckleheads. As much as I want to use the word knuckleheads as my subject, I know that a subject can't be in a prepositional phrase, so I have to use that word bunch as my subject. So we have bunch, and then we have our verb, which is released. And then I'm saying the bunch released what? And so in the visitor's locker room is in a prep phrase. And so here's a dozen piglets. It's like saying 12 piglets. So piglets is my direct object. Let's get piglets in here. All right, let's add in those words of a bunch of knuckleheads. And then it is release them in the visitor's locker room, and we have a dozen piglets. So think about that. Think about how a sort of modifies dozen, and think about how dozen modifies piglets. It's a dozen piglets. So it's a dozen piglets, but it's a dozen, as opposed to like saying 3 dozen or 4 dozen or 1 dozen, a dozen. So this a touches dozen, but dozen touches piglets. All right? We've done this before. And we put that word dozen in here. And then we want a. It's not a piglets, but it's a dozens. We don't want a to touch piglets. We just want to touch dozens. We're going to come out and down. All right, so out and down with that word a. And lastly is in the visitor's locker room. All right, tells us where they were released in the room. And we have the room, locker room, visitor's room. And there it be. Looking good. All right, try practicing pattern 7. Just to recap then, these are direct objects we're looking at. And so they answer what and whom. They follow an action verb. And the thing is, pattern 7 we're going to use as a basis for 8, 9, 10. All right? So they'll all have direct objects in them. So it's the basis for the rest of those. But right now, just simply practice pattern 7.